Shalom to you from oneforisrael.org. This week's Torah portion, Deuteronomy 3:32 to 7:11, is called 봐에트하난, which meant "and I pleaded." Today, I would like to focus on chapter 4. This chapter is without a doubt one of the most hopeful passages in the entire Torah. Deuteronomy 4 marks a turning point in the book. Chapters 1 to 3 focus on the failures and successes of the desert journey. Chapters 4 to 29 focus on God's commandments and the importance of obedience. We can see this change in focus in verse 1. "And now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the rules that I am teaching you, and do them, that you may live, and go in and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you." If Israel is to enjoy life in the promised land, they must obey God's commandments. The central theme in chapter 4 is the dangers of idolatry and the making of images. In verses 3 to 4, Israel is told to remember the sin of Baal Peor, as well as the fate of those who worshipped false gods. Then in verse 9 and following, Israel is commanded not to forget how God appeared to Israel on Mount Sinai. "Then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice." Moses is saying, "Israel, don't forget that when I appeared on Mount Sinai, you didn't see a form, and so don't you dare make a form or image in the future." The chapter offers several warnings with respect to idolatry, two of which are worth repeating. In verse 16, Israel is warned not to act corruptly by making idols. In verse 23, Israel is encouraged not to forget the covenant of the Lord your God. Sadly, and in spite of these very clear warnings, Moses prophetically anticipates Israel's future apostasy in the Promised Land in verses 25 to 28. He writes, "When you father children and children's children and have grown old in the land, if you act corruptly by making a carved image in the form of anything, and by doing what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, so as to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that you will soon utterly perish from the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess. You will not live long in it, but will be utterly destroyed. And the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord will drive you." Though there is an "if" in the English version, "if you act corruptly," the Hebrew can also be translated, "you will act corruptly." Israel will act corruptly. They will forget the covenant. They will be scattered among the nations, as biblical history later confirms. If disobedience is a prophetic certainty, then where is Israel's hope? According to verse 31, Israel's hope is in the merciful God who will never destroy you. The word used here for destroy is the same Hebrew word used to describe Israel's acting corruptly. But here we see that God will never treat Israel as Israel treated him. In this same verse, 31, we also are told that the merciful God will never forget the covenant he swore to the patriarchs, unlike the Israelites who forgot the Sinai covenant. And this merciful God who won't destroy or forget his people is that same God who assures Israel in verse 30 that Israel will return to him in the last days, the end times. There is no conditionality attached to this return. It is a promise rooted in God's mercy. Israel's hope is not contingent upon her obedience to the Sinai covenant, but upon the merciful God who will fulfill his promises to the patriarchs in the last days. And so, dear friend, no matter how far you've strayed, let me encourage you through Israel's example. There is hope for you as well. Please join us again next week for another installment of 5 Alive. Wishing you God's shalom from One for Israel. And don't forget to share.
Our ministry, One for Israel, is an initiative of native-born Israelis on the forefront of media and high-tech evangelism, boldly proclaiming salvation to Israel. Raising up leaders and equipping them with the tools they need to transform our communities. We also provide humanitarian aid to Holocaust survivors with the love of Yeshua. Join us as we share the gospel in Israel. Become one for Israel.